Hello, I'm Kyle Jones. Today we are going to be exegeting Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The first few words probably won't get past the first word, but we're going to try to within this next hour time frame. All right, so we know in this classroom that the original Old Testament is what we say. We'll say the Tanakh and the Ne'evi, the Law and the Prophets, were written in Hebrew. We can say a classical Hebrew. The argument for Ashkenazic and Sephardic is up the air. I think that Sephardic Hebrew is the original language of the ancient Hebrew. But nonetheless, to spare the arguments for such a case, the Genesis account was relayed in an archaic Hebrew. We tend to think of the Hebrew letters. Let's say if I'm going to write out the first word in Genesis, Ba, Resh, Eth, something like that. That it kind of looks like that. It has always looked like it, and we think that in the days of Moses, you might see something like that in that typology that they wrote in this kind of a square frame or just something roughly like that. But it wasn't the case. The original, more of a pictograph, would have been something like this. That's the ba sound. Actually, that's a shva, an upside down e. Am I doing this right? I think something like that. There's something very sound. It's kind of a stop called a shva or shwa. Just a ba sound. It stops it. This is a rush or resh, but it has a ra sound to it. Ra with a trill. And his picture was that of a man's head. It's kind of interesting. And it means the head of something, the beginning of something. We'll discuss that later in this one too. Sheen was a picture of teeth, biting down. It meant that. We'll talk about later, but it has a sh sound. Ba, ra, sh. This little thing was the helic. The I sound was joined together later in the schools of Babylon by the Pharisees to make sounds that were not necessarily the characters that were not made originally. They already knew the sounds of the vowels they used, but they never wrote them down. They only had the pictogram. And as time evolved with the Hebrew language, the Pharisees at Babylon implemented a lot of the markings, the demarcations of the vowel sounds. So the yod was a ya sound, yod, and it was a picture of an arm with a hand. And finally, the tov sound, and it's actually ta sound. If you have a dagash in there, it makes it hard. Ta sound, but without it, it's a soft sound. So it's but it was the pictogram was a picture of kind of what we would consider a cross. Now you're talking a language that we at least looking at 1500 BC, but prior to that. So this actually is the word when we read it right to left. First, ba, ra, sheath. Okay? Barashith. We would write it out, transliterate it, Bereshith. Bereshith. It means in the beginning. Now, take a moment to look at that. It's on video. You can stop it once you get this on YouTube or DVD. I'm going to go back and erase some of this. Have some room here. Pretty much the scribes, the rabbis, Onkelos, which I think wrote back, he wrote around the 1st century, translated all the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic. was one of our famed respected rabbis or the rabbins who taught the Hebrew language and what it meant in terms of a deeper meaning of the letters and how it was used, and even the using a word versus another word, what it meant within the context of the Torah. Onkelos, another one was Ramban, another scribe of that same stature, if you will, of the academic world, the academe of his day. I think he was a lot later. I think we could put him in the same era, I believe, that Rashi was in. And also the very famed Moses ben Maimonides. Who wrote a book, and I have this one, as well as I have the Targum, and I have the writings of the rabbis, the commentary with all of them, Onkelos, Ramban, and Rashi. They were the ones who were the respected commentators on the Torah and the prophets. Again, Torah means the law, and the prophets, the Ne'evi, they were the ones, the seers of the prophets for ancient Israel. But Moses ben Maimonides was the scholar who wrote the book called The Guide for the Perplexed. And he discusses Genesis, the creation, with a vocabulary from the Hebrew that he parsed, looked at, saw what it meant in its original form, its ancient archaic meaning, and wrote down what he believed Genesis was saying. Well, I won't go too much further, but to say that Moses ben Maimonides, who wrote around about 1250 A.D., discussed Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and following the accounts of Genesis, of the Big Bang, of the Big Bang as we would know it today. And it wasn't until this past century that we understand the Big Bang, and we heard the echo that around 1960, I believe it was, that we proved that the Earth had an origin. It had an origination point of a singularity. And even up to like the 1960s, not too long ago, we believe that the Earth very well might have been eternal. I know that the Babylonians wrote in the Enuma Elish that all things were eternal. It returns to all matter returns back to an eternal state, and the Greeks believe that, and most of your scientists believe that up until the 60s. But Moses had no investiture to agree with people who believed in that all things were eternal in that sense, or he didn't really have an argument pro or con evolution. It wasn't about that. He was saying things that were accounted for in the Hebrew text that do agree with what we found out in terms of the Big Bang. Unified theorems are pretty much implied in here. And the topics of evolution that we'll discuss later it doesn't have any argument pro or con evolution. He wasn't thinking in those terms. I teach the class, so we have our view about evolution, that it's not pro or con the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not pro or con the gospel, if you will, the gospel of Genesis. They don't contradict. It's like saying the world is we found that the world is bigger, therefore God doesn't exist. It has nothing to do with God. So, in the sense of an argument against him, pro or con. But in this case, we learn from all of the rabbis that I wrote down that Ba always meant, it meant a container. From this point, if I use this as the first letter in the sentence in Genesis of in the beginning, and that's what it does mean, by the way, in the beginning, actually the is implied. It would have been Ba Ha Rashith, but it's in the beginning. but in beginning. It means from here. This right here is a, excuse me, I got chalk in my mouth. From here we start our intellectual pursuit. From here, the container of this knowledge, we begin our minds, the birthing, the creation of thought. So anything from this hand, this cup holder, is how we are to perceive and to calibrate our brains to understand reality, is how God works with us in this natural occurring world. Now, Ba means in. The word in. Ba. Basic vocabulary word. In. The deeper rabbinic view. From this contained calibration. From this point of view. From all that is in here. We go forward to calibrate our minds, to understand. Well, what Dr. Jeffrey Benner did was go back and look at the pictographic form of the Hebrew. And he saw something much deeper than that. And I think than from these point of views. I think these are deep, and I think that they both should be used. What the early pictographic form meant, house plan. And what that means is this. It's like a blueprint. Before it happened, it was established. That's the picture, the pictogram of what would represent the blueprints for making your tent for your tribe. So now, let's put all this together here. House plan, blueprint, equals Ba from the pictographic point. That's your older Hebrew. It does and is used from the sense that the scribes have relayed. The later Ba means from this point we understand, we calibrate. Okay? We calibrate, we understand from this perspective. And I believe that theologically is sound. Though the earliest character was this and not that. But this does not negate that. The Ba, as received by the redactionists, those people who wrote down the Hebrew scriptures, they themselves were inspired. I think that Ezra was inspired, and I think he used this, basically the cucunis, or the wedge shape or the square shaped letters. I believe he used those that he wrote in this script. And I believe that the redactionists, those who wrote down, the amanuenses, the secretaries, if you will, who wrote down the Hebrew scripture, they wrote it down in this fashion, and I believe that's inspired. We hold that God sovereignly used men for his purpose to relay his expression of love as husband to wife, and this glorious, beautiful teaching and expression of him in the Word of God. But I love that the pictogram depicts a house plan. Now, we're only on the first part of the word in the beginning. This is one word, Barashith. It's a construct, in beginning. Okay? It's actually, and with a feminine ending on it. So we have an inflection to show that it's in the feminine. It received, it is a reception or receptacle of something that was created, which we'll discuss later. So in this first word, Ba, we have house plan, blueprint. Well, we have now proven over the past few years in the Big Bang, in the beginning, as it was a singularity, a compressed singularity that exploded all stuff that would become material, some not, some still retaining heat, some releasing heat, becoming material. But this singularity from the Big Bang, we just spent an hour discussing the multiverses, that there'd be other multiverses, that be the case, and the M-brain theorem, P-brain theorem, that it would still have to answer to a higher accord that preceded that, or is outside of the physical, the metaphysical, the supernatural, if you will, or a hyper-reality. And I say hyper-reality can be contained in the physical observance. So anything provable, probability, probare in the Latin, that which can be seen, measured, is not good enough when it comes to expansion of intelligence. We can talk about life and nature. We need to understand expansion in breadth and width and depth, and the thickness and the intensity of intelligence as it expands in every direction, that it's going outward and it's implying a higher form of intelligence. As we, quote, evolve, we are evolving into higher forms of intelligence that lead outward to a sense that there must be something higher than even this. Wisdom is not intelligence, it's the usage of it. Wisdom is something to be separate from intelligence, but used with it. And wisdom is not tangible. Neither is intelligence. But the wisdom says, to me anyway, that intelligence, by it evolving, it's evolving and indicating something, though the physical realm would end off here in thermal equilibrium. And I look at this as an orb, a globe, not like some two-dimensional thing here, but at some point we'll have a breakdown, thermal equilibrium, and all things will melt back down and will return to wave matter or light energy, or nothing. I think not, but another story on that one. Thermodynamics says we had a beginning and an end now. All things being equitable, all things break down equally. And every element on our Earth will melt down into pretty much an atomic bomb. But from here to here, we have the probare, what we can prove in the natural sense, in the physical sense. Let's say there's 13 of these in the string theorem, the in-brain theorem. I think you're saying there's like 11 dimensions. I think the argument is 13 now. Each of us being like a meson, we're on a quark level, at least we're on some micro level way beyond an atom. And we're saying now that you can exist here, completely have an antimatter experience and be here, or be there at the same time, and that one disappears completely. No exhaust of burning up or evaporating, but truly disappearing. There's a difference than burning up, blowing up, and being accounted for within equals MC squared. We're beyond equals MC squared, and we're now into the possibility of having two multiverses at the same time, where at least the implication is there, that if that can be there and also disappear and vacuum pop up here on such a subatomic level, that how might we ourselves operating in some vacuum, or not in a vacuum, it doesn't matter, that we could exist as you over here and over you over here. Mm-hmm. Even doing the different decisions. Well, I said earlier, if that be the case, what I say precedes, envelops everything, is the marriage contract between God and us. And that's the common sense, the wisdom that's applied here. Let's say that you have a different life over here, and if you are you, supposedly, well, you are known by your relationship to whatever is relative to you in this timeline. That's why we're operating a timeline, lest the other things make us completely irrational. Then we should have a very irrational life. Mm-hmm. But we operate on rational things in order to launch spaceships up into space. We have to deal in the rational. If we're medical doctors, we deal in the rational to heal somebody, not the irrational. Rationality with the big R says be rational. So that's what we're not rationalists, rationalizing things away, such as God. We are to be rational. What is the word rational? It's the word ratio, ratio in the Latin. It means your ration, your ratio, your apportionment. The word itself implies you are given some slice of the pie to understand X, Y, and Z, where he's given A, B, and C. That's interesting that the word implies a kind of deity, like the Greeks, the morai, or the Latin, the Romans, fortuna. They apportion you your life and your allotment. Well, the word more was used in the New Testament to say your apportionment, what you're given, your talents, your gift. The word implies a deity. What were you given? Even to the Greek mind, to the Roman mind. Even in the mythologies, what were you given by the Fates, the Moirai? And of course, we did a tremendous study on Macbeth, the Fates, the Fortunae, the three witches, the Weirding sisters, who fated by Hecate Macbeth's life. And then we discussed that. We did a lengthy study on that. But to say this, the argument, if you could have two of you, what would it matter if you are in a relationship with a God? Let's just say this. What if you're in a relationship with your wife? It can't be two of you having a relationship with two of them at the same time. It wouldn't make logical sense. It's you are having a relationship with your wife, and that's that. You are dealing with her, and you're growing with her in this confine. If you are another one of you and another one of your wives over here, that's between them and them. But where are you cognizant? Where are you conscious? Where is your consciousness? Right here, the here and now. If you're over there with a consciousness, that's between that Quinn and that Sam. That's your fiance. Well, likewise with my Sam, my Samantha, me. I'm with them in the here and the now. I know them as we know them. That's the same relationship between us and the God. The argument would be, couldn't there be multi-Christ dying for multi-use? Well, maybe God wants to work like that. But again, that wouldn't be a dismissal for God. But it wouldn't make rational sense in our ratio, our apportioned sense for the here and the now, and our ontological referent present now, here. You know what I'm saying? So let it be. What does it matter? Maybe we'll find green, purple apples on Mars. We're going to scream there's no God? You know, it's just senseless. We got to go to the wisdom that supersedes the intelligence, as I was saying. It's not the same thing. So, the Hebrew, ba, from this contained point, we understand, if you will, I'm going to put a ba, Hebrew ba, backwards. We go from here to understand how it happened. Though there be more activity than just this contained environment of knowledge and wisdom, it is the Hebrew scriptures that are implying that if we understand life from a God, a singularity, and that He created something out of nothingness, that we would understand that things took form and evolved, if you will, to the Logos, or the Christ, as that Christ would fulfill the meaning of law, the meaning of extrapolating a group of Iberu people or Hebrew people out of a murderous culture to begin with, that was polygamous, that was chauvinist. Not just the Jews. People condemn the Jews for for killing their children. Everybody killed their children for human sacrifice in the world that worshipped the fertility goddess or the sun god. Kohana Baal, cannibalism, means to be the priests of Baal, to consume the human flesh because you were the mouth of God. Go back to the agape love table for what it really meant. When we say, agape, it's my church. Agape meant to literally lay down the pharmakeia, the virgin, drug her, and consume of her flesh in every way, but eat her. Because she was the sacrifice for the God, and you, this priest, being the, quote, mouth of God, would consume of the perfect sacrifice. And Israel was practicing syncretism. They were syncing up with pagan practices because, after all, God's name is Baal, the generic term for God, or El, so what? Well, and what was happening is Israel was getting caught up in pagan practices by their brother, their neighbors, intermarrying and joining together beliefs. They had made God's name a homogeneous meaning. That's why God brought in His law and who He was in exactitude to pull them out of a culturally referential paganism. God was pulling the ancient Hebrews out and saying, I will show my sign, my emblazon in you. But He made it relative. And they were still in a rationed sense Middle Easterners. And many people practiced human sacrifice. Abraham didn't think that to be a strange thing, that God would come down and say, kill your son, Isaac. But there was a better way. And God says, don't do it, use the ram. But that ram is nothing more than a symbol that will later become the atoning God, Christ. So everything is rational within the perspective of how we live life. God is condescending to us to deal with us on a rational level that we understand. Like say I'm a drummer. God will affect me in my drumming life to lead me out of some things because he's condescending to me, and but understanding my perspective, the way I see through things, perspective, as a drummer first, then as a theologian next, and then as a linguist, and then as a theologian again, or whatever, scientist. He's lead of something, but he came down into my hell to pull me out of it with the rational view of God from my perspective. He didn't just brainwash me and kind of sliver my brain out and make me see God or not see God. He was gentle with that. And that's what happened with Israel. They were given a perspective in the Word of God and brought through the Word of God into a bigger, more evolved sense of Logos, that he is the Lamb of Atonement. He is the one that fulfilled all the pictures and shadows and types of this singularity of the Jewish religion. But it was in the word Ba that meant literally the floor plans, and from this we go forward. Well, we found out there's a universe in this past few years, there's a universal flux, well, we defined it better, a universal flux that precedes the matter. And in this ill-defined or undefined space, I shouldn't say ill-defined, undefined space, it preceded, this is all one singularity, by the way, but when it exploded, this universal flux took place, it was still immaterial, almost like antiparticles, but not. It's not antimatter, unless it negates something, but it was of that ilk where it was not material. And then it became material. Well, this material, this stuff that came out of this undefined mass, science says now, quantum physics states now that this also contained time, matter, thermodynamics, and the fatalism of thermodynamics from point A to point B. Now I have a question for myself as well as everybody else. If we're here right now at say A 3/4, like Harry Potter coming down to the train station, I forgot what gate it was. Was it 13 1/3? I forgot what it was. It was pretty. They were to meet at some fractional point. If we got to here, and let's say this is 1920. 1920, and all the people that lived in 1920 all over the world are a result of that which is supernatural, or should I say out of reality, out of the physicality. We got here in 1920 from the industrial age, past the age of reason to the industrial age, because of intelligence. If we didn't have intelligence and a theology and communique and anti-theology, we would have never got to here in this fashion. So the supernatural, that which is above the physical or the natural, and we can define natural in many different ways, and physical, and in a sense maybe in one way for right now. Intelligence is above or super or outside of the natural means. Well, if this singularity ordained all of things that would take place and all the energy contained to end here at point B, and we go to this place, but all of our experience has to do with intelligence leading us from one to the other. Language, the ideas that cannot be touched yet, but they have consequences later. Those are all the energies that be. Or are they not? And if we say that physics can prove no God, or, I'm just saying that's the latest quote findings from Stephen Hawking, how do you account for the intelligence that comes into our minds that are accounted for in all activity from the quantum flux or the universal flux to the end of time? What I'm trying to say is, because of this blueprint, this house plan, Ba, the very first word of in the beginning, we have a singularity that unfolded, and that means all of the physical universe, including intelligence. Now, it's going to argue for itself. I'm not as smart as the argument that's being presented here on a godly fashion. This singularity that is the expansion and is the stuff over 15 billion years that will have an ending point at some time includes, it has to, number one, include all of your conversations about God and love and pain and everything else. This would have to include in a singularity intelligence itself. And all of your relationships and all the babies you'll ever have and their grandchildren. This singularity point with the universal flux is stating the ultimate predestination. Not fatalism anymore. Fatalism, well, I could argue for that too. Fatua, that which is fated. But fatality means death. And fatality means thermal equilibrium. It means the end of it all. Predestination in the Greek, of the Greek New Testament, means fatalism, of course. Means all things going to death. That's right. That's the gospel too. But we have an overcoming of death. But fatalism means all things going to its expiredness. Predeterminism, prohorizo, means prior to, in Romans 8, chapter 8, following all through Romans 9, prohorizo is the word used. It means pre-horizon. Pro-horizon. Pro-horizo. That's just the common nominative form of it. Prohorizo. Prohorizo. I think it is it the delta? You take the delta and the zeta. I think that's it. Prohorizo. Before the horizon. Before horizon. Before the contact point of singularity to mass effect. On the cusp. Pre-horizon. Over here. The intangible became boom, tangible. And then we had it equals mc squared. All matter is equals light, equals energy, equals force, equals energy, equals time. It's all consumed in one mass effect over time. There's Einstein's equation. The multiverse is going beyond that. It's building on it to some extent, but it's going beyond equals mc squared. But for right now, we're just at equals mc squared. But I say again, is the argument for God still that all the events, X, Y, and Z, to the end of time, took place and had to be accounted for in the fatalistic view, but we get to the fate because of the intelligence that led us to the fate. It takes intelligence to get to this point in this fashion, and quote, this fashion was brought together by intelligence. But this fashion was predetermined at the singularity. So do you include the supernatural, which is the mind that can't be touched, and love, and pain, and suffering? That had to be part of this whole equation. So Mr. Scientist, Mrs. Scientist, do you account for the universal flux, the singularity, predetermining also who you love? That's intangible. What do we do? We're perplexed, aren't we? Well, are your tears energy? Are they exhaust of energy? Yeah, they are. When your heart beats harder for your child when you see your child born, are you exhausting energy? Yeah, you are. That energy, that bee that exhausts your heart, that makes you breathe, will make somebody wait a pause a second later because they're looking at you, loving your child. And because they waited there, they might have not gotten in their car sooner to run into another car to have a fatal wreck to kill themselves, which led their children to go to another parent. maybe their great aunt, which caused them to have a different life. That, you see what I'm saying? Everything requires everything. Was it Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, said, I've been led to the conclusion that to account as a writer is parallel to that of God. The more I write, so many personages in my book, I think it was like 1,000 persona in his book, War and Peace, I don't know, something like that. He said, I found myself becoming more as God and so much lesser than God. Because I realized every person I write into the story has to be accounted for, and everything they do affects everybody else in this way. And if I don't write like that in this hologram of this cause and effect, I'm a lesser than writer. I realized what a lesser than writer I was. It's kind of, and that's the idea that he's getting over. There is a type of predeterminism being a good writer. You've got to look at that from perspective. One person does this, and it causes that person to do that in a ripple effect. That's an old one. But the ripple effect has to do with intelligence. How do you touch, taste, smell, or measure that? And furthermore, we now know that preceding this universal flux, something had to have come into this universe to cause that. Now the multiverse universe can say, well, it happened from another multi-universe. But what caused the actions of that entropy to take place in that multi-universe? It might not be any more complex. If it's a multi-universe, a parallel universe, it's no more complex than ours. It's just different exhaust. It's just thermodynamics acting onto different objects. But the law of thermodynamics is like that of the Greek logos, the word for Christ. The laws that be, the invisible math that will, as coat hangers, hold on to the material, the stuff, when the stuff has found its place to orbit around, to settle down. Planets, you, I, we were at one time wave particles, and beyond that, we were just light energy. We were light at one time. The greatest, hottest heat that we could measure, and then not measure. We were that. And we became material. That's that. That's it. Everybody understands that. But it all cooled down. That's where you get your orbits. Solar systems mean around the solar sun, around their suns. They cool down in orbits, and the effect, they circle, they spin, they find that they're operating on hidden laws. What established the laws of the material that we can measure in physics? What established that? Because it was invisible. It couldn't be measured. They were the intangible containers of the stuff that came into creation. And there's no other language to use but the God factor language that explains anything past the probability world, the probare in the Latin, the proving ground. How do you prove you love somebody? How do you prove that you love Sam so much? You prove to nobody. You can only prove to Sam by your actions over all your life with her in a relationship. That's my argument for this ministry, is that we have got to look at the creation, the world, as marital terminology. We have to look at the marriage relationship between us and God. That's how we're going to understand predestination. We don't start with predestination. We start with the marriage contract. Predestination is a byproduct of our relationship to this husband. Us being on the receiving end. In the feminine case, we receive of the penetration of intelligence of this God. And everything, the penetration of everything. We are the natural Gaia, the Greeks called the feminine goddess of the ground, the nature. And it is the God who penetrates us, that goes into us and shapes us and expresses his Shem, or his name, his authority, into us. Now, all that said, that's implied in the mind of the rabbins in the word Ba. Because it says, here's the blueprint before it happened. Moses, Maimonides, thank you, 800 years ago. Oh, gee, a few years ago we finally defined the universal flux and its singularity. Here's the blueprints prior to it happening. Now I can say the intangible part, In the mind of God, I can say in the singularity, and I can say in the universal flux before it became material, that all intelligence, all story, all anything in time that would happen began here before it became material. The Latin phrase ex nihilo nihilo fit is applied in the physical sense, not the theological sense. Ex nihilo, out of nothingness, something came. Well, define no thing. You're still defining something, because your point of reference is a thing or no thing. We can't think inside the box of literally nothing in the sense of no thing. There's not even a word that we can really use for that. We can say antiparticle, but your reference is because there's particles. Well, gee whiz, there's a preternatural language that God used. When there was nothing, out of something, God called into existence this thing. Now, we'll discuss the Mayim, Tokyu, Vabokyu, Choshek. What they mean is what we would say nothing. It was still something. But it was something of nothingness that the physicists would say. They would be forced to say, if there's nothing. But their relevance is to their connotation of what nothing is. And our nothingness is of a theological sense of nothing that is. And in that sense, the theological that can't be measured makes much more sense when it's entered into the laws of physics than what the physicists have to say. Because the ultimate conclusion that I've heard from the physicists now is that, well, we probably had to have come from aliens. You know, now we're forcing physicists to actually say the probability that possibly we came from alien material. But you're still dealing with a created cosmos that was still under the Big Bang's principle. We're talking about prior to that. People are unwilling to say a God, but they're willing to say an alien without a systematic theological meaning behind it. And as we discuss the book of Genesis alone, we're going to see that rationality, reason, is built into the singularity.